Hello there and welcome back to another video here on Wristwatch Revival. My name is Marshall, I'm your host, and this time we're going in a different direction. The last few watches I've worked on have been really kind of expensive, important watches to me. This one's not. This is actually a Raketa. It's a Soviet watch. It's from the former Soviet Union in the 80s, probably is when this was made. I got it for less than $50 on eBay. Less than $50 for a vintage watch that is... Well, it's interesting to say the least. It's hard to describe the dial. It's got so much going on with the Roman numerals and the numbers kind of floating and this turning thing that you can see kind of on the bottom. It's a weird watch, but a cool conversation starter, and it's a neat vintage piece. And the reason I wanted to get into this is because A, I never had a Raketa or any of the Soviet watches, and I've heard a lot about them. And B, because I know that a lot of you wanted to get into vintage watches or into watchmaking. And, you know, some of the pieces I've been working on are way too expensive to be starter pieces. This thing's under $50. You can get these things on eBay all day long. And there's even a bunch of different models from them. As you can see, this one's in pretty bad shape, the one that I happened to get here. But I wanted to find out what these things were all about. And I wanted to also extend that to you because, again, I know that a lot of you are looking to get into watchmaking or looking to get into vintage watches, and these might be a cool place to start out. So together, onward, let's find out if this thing's a total piece of junk or if it's actually a pretty cool watch that you can wear and enjoy. Okay, so the first thing we need to do, though, before we get into the watch, of course, is see how it does on the time grapher. So let's throw it on the time grapher and see what it gives us for an initial reading. Ooh, oh no. Oh no. This is bad. So as you can see, it's given us a bit of a snow globe effect there, as well as pretty terrible everything. The rate, 3 minutes a day off. It's losing 3 minutes a day, etc. So clearly it needs a service at the very least. But with that, let's get into this. First, let's just take off the case back here and see what the movement looks like. I'm really curious to see what the quality is like on these movements. They made these for years and years. Well, all right, I see a few jewels and it's ticking away. I guess I would say it certainly could be worse than this. That case back looks pretty rough. These are plated. It looks, kind of like a chrome plated case back, it seems. And it seems to have really kind of just come off around the edges. This is a pretty well-worn piece, it seems. But, looking at it, well, I mean, there's a watch in there. So there's this extra little crown that turns that other part. Apparently, we'll look at it later on the dial, but apparently you're able to deduce some type of date range information. As you can see, the crystal's pretty badly cracked here too, so that'll have to go. But at any rate, I don't know what this thing is supposed to be telling us. I'm not even going to bother to find out. Again, they call it a perpetual calendar, but it's obviously not. It has some years and some months and then a bunch of Cyrillic on there. I don't know. It looks cool. I mean, at least in a quirky, weird, kind of so ugly it's cool sense. And maybe it'd be a good conversation starter or something. I don't know. But first things first, of course, we got to get the movement out of the case here. And it looks like this is just held in by two movement screws. Again, I've never actually worked on a Russian watch before or a Raketa, more specifically. And I am really curious to see about the build on these. Stuff that came out of the former Soviet Union was kind of not thought of as particularly high quality stuff. And I would assume the same for this, especially given the price that I paid for the thing. I mean, sure, it's in bad shape, but I think I can clean this thing up. And for $50, if I could get anything I could wear or give to a friend or whatever, I'd be happy. So first things first, I got to get this movement out of here, but it doesn't want to go. And looking at the top, this feels like it might be one of those weird watches where the movement actually comes out of the front. So I'm just going to take off this broken crystal. I'm going to use this crystal grabber thing that I have. I'm sure there's another way I could get this thing off, but I couldn't figure it out. So boom, there, it comes off. And again, it was broken and I knew that. So that's fine. And you get a better look at the dial and whatever the heck is going on on the dial. It really is kind of a mishmash of a bunch of different styles. As you can see, this crystal's done though. but I still can't figure out how to get the movement off. And then I'm looking a little closer and I'm like, oh, the bezel comes off. That's what I needed to take off. So it turns out I didn't actually need to take the crystal off. In that way, I could have probably just pushed it out or taken it off with my crystal press, but that's fine. I needed to come off anyway, and that was a perfectly safe way to do it. So with the bezel off, now I'm assuming that this movement should just pop right out. And there it goes. Comes right off. And we can take a look at the case. It actually looks like it's an okay shape on the inside at least. No rust or anything either. And this is that ring that goes around the edge that I was turning that has some type of vital information on it that is, I don't know, is it useful? Who cares? Probably, but it looks cool. It's got all these years and weird stuff on there going back from the 80s up to looks like the mid 90s or something. I don't know. So there's the dial. Definitely looks like it's in original good condition here. Again, you do have to be careful buying these on eBay. I've read a little bit in it that it said that people will Frankenstein or Frankenwatch these quite a bit, meaning that they'll take parts from all different types of things and put them together. And that could even be the case on this one, like especially in the case of the case back, which looked like it wasn't as worn as the rest, but who knows? But it looks like this dial is very much original. Again, this thing's kind of barely ticking. So let's get the dial off so that we can continue our journey into this thing. I will say that at this point, not bad. I mean, yeah, this isn't up to like, Swiss or Japanese standards or anything, but this is I don't know, for $50, it seems like okay, especially if I can get the dang thing running. And it is a day date. Has both the month and the day there. So this just pops off. And underneath we can see at least the beginnings of the calendar and motion works. The calendar works, well, that's probably self-explanatory. It's what runs the calendar. And the motion works is what runs the hands. So that's the cannon pinion in the middle. And then I'm just kind of browsing here because I need to try to figure out how each thing works. This is a little different than some of the other movements that I've worked on. And that makes sense. I mean, this was, made in a different country. You'll see little movement differences between countries or styles of design or engineering or something like that. Whoop. There we go. And this is a cover plate for the calendar works, and so we can take that out. And again, I mean, this movement looks like it hasn't been touched in a heck of a long time, but it's far from a disaster. There's a bunch of like gummed up lubricant and a tiny bit of rust staining, but it doesn't look like this has been abused or anything. So I got that to be thankful for. Because again, this is a real crap shot. I mean, when you order something like this off of eBay, this one came from Ukraine. It took 3 weeks or something. It's just one of those things where you just do not know what you're going to get. And, that's kind of part of the deal. It's $50. And if it turns up and it's a piece of junk, well, you kind of knew that going in is how I see it. So continuing along here, we're taking apart the calendar works. Oop. Seems a little stubborn. And that looks like the cam that pushes the calendar over or something. There's a spring that acts on it. So far, so good. Things coming right apart, and it looks relatively straightforward. Here's my cannon pinion remover. And this is a special tool to safely remove the cannon pinion rather than using tweezers, which risks bending the pivot that it sits on. There's a thin piece of metal, that the cannon pinion kind of hugs. And if you go twisting on it with your tweezers, you could bend or break that, where the cannon pinion remover takes it off pretty cleanly. All right, let's get this thing in the movement holder and continue along. First things first, we'll take the balance off, mainly just to protect it. It's the most important part of a watch. It's also the most delicate with they call it the hairspring, or the balance spring is what I like to call it, but either way. Very delicate spring. They call it a hairspring for an obvious reason. It's about the size of a human hair, as far as thickness goes. All right, now we can take the pallet forks out. Also, I noticed a lot of you in the comments and on Instagram have asked about how you remember which part goes where, or which screws go where. And for me, the answer is a combination of two things. One, experience, which admittedly I don't have a ton of as an amateur at this. I've only been doing it for a year or two or something. But, and here comes out the pallet forks, by the way. But you do start to see these things. Speaking of experience, I do have a lot more experience working on other things, like, for example, cars. I haven't recently, but for a good portion of my life, I worked on cars. And, you start to really get a feel for mechanical things like screws or bolts or things like that really does translate over. I'm not going to lie. It's helped me a lot to have that kind of aptitude for that stuff. So experience is one of them where you just go, well, it can't be any of those screws. So it's either this screw or this screw. And then maybe you try one out, and if it's wrong, you just do the other one. The other thing, though, that I think is really important, and if you are starting off in watchmaking, I was certainly taught to do this. Again, a lot of my teachings came from Mark Lovick over at the Watch Repair channel here on YouTube. Excellent stuff. I mean, seriously, the gold standard for all of this stuff, a big inspiration to me as well. But, he also has a training course at watchrepairlessons.com, and no, he's not paying me or anything for that. I happen to have taken it and enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. And I figured I would, pass that along to you in case you were interested in trying it out, because it really does start from the ground up and gives you that kind of one-on-one feel where you're watching these videos that he's made, but he explains it. It's in written and video form, so you can go at your own pace in your own way. And it really helped me out a lot. There's 3 courses with apparently a 4th one coming. I'm excited about that. But what he taught me to do was to take a photo of what I was working on. And interestingly, that's actually how this channel kind of got going. I do video work and stuff like that for my regular job, if you will. And so I was like, well, instead of photos, I'll just take a video. Like, I've got cameras. I'll just set up a camera real quick and just take a video. And then if I ever get stuck, I can just go back and watch the video. Well, that led to me going, well, if I can take a video that's kind of crappy, I could probably take a video that's kind of good. And if I'm going to take a video, and then my creative brain got going, and I thought, well, I'll just, put it up on YouTube, and I'll just do a little voiceover, and I'll just record a little extra thing. And hey, another camera. And next thing you know, I was starting a YouTube channel, which is kind of par for the course for me. But I digress. I was doing the videos, and when I'm reassembling a watch, I will get that video up on the computer in front of me, and if I get stuck, I'll reference it. Now, when it comes to the final edit here that you see, I'll cut the parts off where I'm just staring at the video because, well, that's kind of boring to watch. But I do use that as a reference if I get stuck or if I can't remember exactly how a thing goes, and I recommend doing that as well. It's very, very helpful. Okay, so we have really gotten pretty far into this watch now. It's time to take off the train bridge, which means that the train of wheels is One of the only things left to go here, just that and the keyless works. So here we go. Whoop. That's also why you'll see me kind of inspect each of these, like as a habit. Sometimes I edit that part out, but like here, I'll take a look and just see which way is this orientated, right? Does it has the pinion on the top? Does it have the little gear part on the top? And that helps me commit it to my memory so that when I go back to put the watch together, I can go, right, I remember how that went together now. And then again, if I get stuck, I can always look at the video too. And it looks like there's a bridge here just for that main wheel underneath. I already took out the escape wheel and the other ones. And again, none of these components are really burly, awesome things, but they're all reasonably made. Nothing I've seen here has made me think, well, this thing's just a piece of junk and it won't last. I'm not exactly blown away by the by the quality of these components. They're not high quality in the sense of like when we worked on the Rolex or something like that, and you go, wow, okay, I can see how much extra effort the company put in to really make these things super robust and bulletproof. That isn't what you see here at all. This is thin, stamped out, cheap parts, I guess you would say, but not below the threshold where you go, okay, this is junk. This was meant to be thrown away. That isn't the case. These are reusable, serviceable, real parts. So, I'm kind of impressed, honestly. Again, for the amount of money, this is definitely above what I expected once I got into the watch. I thought this thing was going to be really bad. Okay, take the yoke out here, and I'm just being careful with the yoke spring there. Standard stuff, just try your best to not let the things fly away. I've done it many times. I've spent a lot of time on my hands and knees with a light, with a flashlight, trying to find a little spring like that. And if you can avoid it, it's definitely better to avoid it. This is the last of the keyless works coming apart now. That's the setting lever. And this thing really does need a good cleaning. This watch is quite filthy, as you can see. There's a lot of dried up oil and grease on this watch that needs to be addressed. And so I'm happy that we're giving it a good service. And I'm really starting to get hopeful here that I can bring this thing back to like a decent state as well, especially given that nothing's actually broken inside here. Last thing that we need to do before we get to cleaning, though, is we need to take the mainspring out of the barrel. Yikes. Ooh, look at that. That's just grease. That's just dirt and grease just caked on the top of it. There should not be that much of that in there. And as you can see, the mainspring looks pretty dirty too. Yeah, this is all just evidence that this watch has been neglected. And it's not necessarily surprising, but at the same time, it's kind of interesting because when I find a watch like this that clearly hasn't been serviced in forever, this is kind of what you want because you get these for so much cheaper because they're running bad or not running at all. But sometimes that's because one of the components is just outright broken, right? In which case you have to source a new one, which can be a pain or can be more expensive. But when they just need a good cleaning, lubrication, little attention to detail, you can really have a good expectation on bringing these type of watches back to a darn good state. Okay, everything needs to go into the watch cleaning machine now. So that means putting everything in these little baskets and then in the bigger basket and then into the watch cleaning machine. I do have a video on the channel of the watch cleaning machine that I got and how it works if you're interested. One thing I always forget is to put the balance back on. This way, when it goes into the watch cleaning machine, the balance gets cleaned as well, but it's not loose where it can get hurt. And there you go. All the parts of the watch. You can see the broken crystal that needs to get replaced, of course. And that means that with them all cleaned and ready to go, we can start putting things back together. There's numerous types of oils and greases that you use in watches like this. There's not as many as you think, though. But there's a couple specialty ones. This one is called Mobius, which is the company 8200, and this is specifically for these mainsprings. And what I do here is just put a little tiny bit on my finger cots there, and then just put a thin film over it. This isn't meant to be actually like a lubrication. It's meant to be like a thin surface film so that it doesn't get corroded and that it doesn't stick or do anything like that. So that means that now it's time to wind the mainspring back into the barrel, which is a tedious and weird thing to do if you don't have one of these. This is a mainspring winder. So this lets you wind it back up into a little space and then push it back into the barrel. It's a specialty tool. It's very expensive. It's extremely handy, though, if you do a lot of the work that I'm doing here, where I'm oftentimes reusing a mainspring, because on a bunch of these watches, they can be a real pain to find a new one or a replacement one. And if they're still in good shape, I will reuse them. Oh, God, I love that noise. Seriously, that's like a watchmaker thing. If you... If you do a lot of watch, if you were around this stuff, the noise that spring, I love it. I absolutely love it. Okay, so the arbor goes in now that the mainspring's in there. And we need to put a little bit of oil on there as well. And then I picked up this little thing that lets you put the cap back on a little safer than just sort of pushing it on with your fingers. Apparently, it was cheap. I got it on eBay. What you'll see is there's a lot of tools made by the big Swiss companies. Bergeon is kind of the most commonly seen high-level one. They make excellent stuff. Really, their tools and stuff are fantastic, but they're very expensive. And it's interesting because the Chinese manufacturing market, as they've done with many things, has said, well, look, we can make that. And in some cases, they actually can. A simple tool like this little plastic thing that does that is actually quite easy to make, up to standards, in China. But then some of the stuff isn't, right? Like some of the really complicated stuff can be quite difficult to make for a cheap price, and you wouldn't want to skimp on that. Okay, so let's get the main plate back out. And again, we've got the balance here. And I'll just set that aside once again just to keep it safe, because that doesn't go on until quite a bit later. And we need to be maneuvering around the movement quite a bit, oiling things, putting on the components and all of that kind of stuff. And I don't need that balance just sitting there getting knocked around, especially when you're at the level that I'm at, where, some things you feel like, hey, I'm getting this. Like, I'm getting pretty good at this. And then other things you do and you go, am I an idiot or what? Right? It is one of those things that as you're learning, you can pick up some stuff and start to feel confident. But then you get constant reminders that you're very much an amateur. And so I like to play it safe when it comes to the balance. So put the wheel in there, and then we can go ahead and put this bridge back on as well. And this is a good example of just like, which screw was it again? I think it's this one. And now I'm going to do some oiling. You can see that I've got my loop out there to start to do just a little bit of the early oiling on these parts that are going in. And now the rest of the train wheels can start to go in. And as usual, just trying to be as careful as I can. I think that that's the thing I'm trying to work on the most as a watchmaker, is just really taking your time and not rushing anything. That's the escape wheel going in, kind of snug it in underneath that bridge. And that's, of course, the mainspring barrel. When you look at all of the sort of traditionally designed watches, even this one, the mainspring barrel is actually what you would call that the first wheel. It's sort of the originator of all the power. Then there's a second wheel, a third wheel, a fourth wheel, and then an escape wheel. And you can always kind of see how they're laid out in different ways and how they go. But the trick to remembering which is to know that the barrel is the first one. But nobody ever calls it the first wheel. That's where it gets kind of weird. All right, and now we get to do a little dance where we have to get these pivots. That's the little points at the end, and they have to go into their jewel hole. Those are the little red dots there that are very low friction synthetic sapphires. But in order for everything to get set up right, each of those wheels that has a pivot at the top, which is all of them, has to go directly on the top and bottom into their respective jewel holes. And if any one of them is out, it won't spin and it won't sit right. But once you kind of locate the holes, then you can see just even a little bit of pressure on any of the wheels will turn all of the other ones. Even the first wheel, or the mainspring barrel, as we discussed. And then, again, I learned this from Watch Repair channel from Mark, is, it can help, especially if it's not really sitting beautifully, to use a piece of pegwood to kind of stabilize the bridge as you go to initially tighten down the screws that hold it down. The reason for this is simple. If something shifted and you didn't notice, and one of the pivots is not in its jewel hole, and then you went and tightened it down, you could break it so easy. I mean, these pivots are tiny pieces of metal. You could break them without much effort at all. And that's why you use the pegwood and do all the little double checking just to keep making sure that the train wheel is spinning freely. Because if it is, then that means that those pivots are in their jewel holes and you're safe. So here's one last check just to make sure that everything seems to be spinning smooth and it looks fine. Now we can put the barrel bridge on. And normally, and in this case, the barrel bridge holds the barrel in place with that big bushing right in the middle there, but it also holds some other components on it. Typically, you'll see it hold the way that you actually wind the barrel, meaning that when you turn the crown on the side of your watch when you're wearing it to wind it up, well, that turning motion has to get transferred over to that mainspring barrel, the spring inside of that barrel. And the works that does that is usually attached to this barrel bridge as well. It just seems to be the way that most of these are made. And that's the way that this one's made as well. And once again, I'm getting in and doing a little bit of oiling here. I'm using a loop to make sure that I can actually see exactly that the right amount and the right oil's going in. I'm using HP 1300. That's a mid viscosity oil, I guess you would say. It's the one that you use on parts that aren't super high impact for a watch, but that aren't super delicate either. It's like the mid-grade watch. The super high impact stuff actually gets a grease, a synthetic grease that I use, again from Mobius. I think it's called 9541. I might be wrong about that. 9501? Yeah, that sounds right. And then there's one called 9010 that you use on the very delicate pivots. Like that one right there is that HP 1300 again. It's a synthetic oil. So that was the ratchet wheel that I put on the big one there, and now I'm putting on the crown wheel. And again, these are the parts that I was just mentioning a minute ago. These are the ones that actually wind up the watch, that take the power of you winding the crown on the side of your watch and transfer it over to where the mainspring is. There's also the click and the click spring going on, and that just is a way that you can wind the watch one way but not let it unwind the other way. So we'll get the click in place, but I also still have to screw down the crown wheel screw there. And one thing that you'll notice about it is that it's got 3 lines on the top of it. I'm going to screw that one in just a second, that one right there. And that means that it's reverse threaded. So you actually turn it to the left, as you can see, to tighten it down, which feels very weird. but that is actually how it works. Okay, now we can get in and oil the jewels themselves. Again, we're using Mobius 9010, which is a very fine synthetic oil, and you don't need very much. You really just need a little tiny bit. It's the challenge is actually putting on enough in the sense of not putting on too much. And then, of course, we also need to take care of what we call the cap jewels here. So we're on the microscope now so that you can see how this is done. That thing that I'm taking off there is called an Inca block. This one actually isn't an Inca block, but it's a shock setting. That is actually a spring. It's meant to flex in the case that you drop your watch. I know that sounds kind of weird, but the parts that go into that hole there break very easily. And they're also attached to some fairly heavy things, namely the balance wheel. And that's one of the heavier parts on the watch. And these are extremely finicky, as you can see. I'm doing this on the microscope. And one false move, and that little spring will go flying. And it is so small, you would not imagine it. I mean, this is a type of thing that can get stuck on a fiber of your shirt. Like, it doesn't have enough gravity to just fall away if it touches that. So I'm trying to be very, very touchy here. And this is something that I've gotten better at, but definitely you can still get stung by these stupid little things. They also can be fragile, especially when they're old, like this one is, and these can break. If they're in good shape, they won't. They're actually pretty strong. But anyway, these were invented because, again, if you were to drop your watch, it would jostle that in such a way that it would actually break the pivot, kind of back in the day or whatever. Now it just bumps that spring up a little bit. So look what I'm doing here. I got some Rodico here and I actually put it over the spring first so that it couldn't fly away. I felt very clever at having done this. And now having cleaned and oiled the cap, I'm ready to put this back in. And of course I dropped it right away and it landed on the escape wheel. Not great, but the watchmaking gods were kind to us because as it landed on the escape wheel, I looked down and I noticed that there was a fiber. You see that kind of fiber sitting on there from a shirt or something? And that is not where you want to have anything like that. And I was able to get that off of there. So maybe that was, again, the watchmaking gods looking out for us. I don't really know. Anyway, getting this back in, I decided to abandon my plan of trying to stick a piece of Rodico on there. It just wouldn't stay and it wasn't working right, and go for the 2 tweezer plan. And of course, this is very, very nerve-wracking stuff because this thing is just ready to go flying away at any moment. But I got it. So we got that back in there. And now we can turn our focus back to finishing our build. Now that we have the train of wheels on the other side, we can put the cannon pinion back on and then start working our way through the rebuild here. Again, I'm using that Mobius HP 1300 on some of these parts, and then some of the ones that are more heavy duty, I'm using the 9501 grease, which is that kind of blue synthetic grease. All of the lubricants that I'm using here are synthetic, by the way, at this point. They last longer, they're more consistent. I was reading a watchmaking book that I got that's apparently just a reprint of a very old book. And some of the stuff they suggested using in there was pretty funny. They had like animal fats and like, God, what was it? I think it was like beeswax or something to seal something up. I was like, wow, times have definitely changed. And I don't think the book was that old, but maybe I'm wrong. I am glad we don't have to use stuff like that now, though. Okay, setting lever going into place here. And again, using that 9501. As I work towards putting the yoke back on, this is all for the keyless works. This part actually interfaces with the calendar to let you do a quick date change on it. It's actually a really clever little system that I'll show you when it's all back together, but you actually pull out on the crown, and it's like a spring-loaded pull-out, and it advances the day 1 day per time you do that. It's actually really kind of neat. Okay, now getting that calendar in under the spring. And of course, back to the keyless works, we need to put the yoke spring in as well. Hopefully without it flying away. There we go. And again, these are very high friction points, so I'm using the grease, but I keep getting a little bit too much on there, so I can use some Rodico to kind of clean that up. And this is a commonly used thing as well. It's kind of a cover plate and spring combo. And now we can put in the main parts of the keyless work here, which apologies for it being out of focus here, but the sliding clutch and the clutch wheel, they need a little bit of grease on them as well, because these are probably the parts of the watch that take the most physical abuse. You know, they're really kind of being jammed around and shoved around a bunch. And so you do have to be cognizant of that. Same thing with the winding stem. That needs a decent amount of grease on it as well. And for the same reason. Everything has to kind of line up here for us to be able to get this thing done. And there we go. And I had to take out the yoke there because I had put it, when I put it on before, I had not put in the sliding clutch yet. So I get to do this part again. But we get it back in there, okay? And now I can put that cover plate spring combo back on as well. Yeah, sometimes that happens. I'll notice, hey, I forgot something, and I'll have to backtrack. I've had it happen where I've had to backtrack embarrassingly big chunks of the project. But lately, my mistakes have been more along the lines of this, where I just go, whoops, and have to back up a step or two, thankfully. But it's all part of the learning process. Yeah, these Raketa watches, though, Raketa means rocket in Russian, and you can tell that many of them are inspired by space, or, you know, space exploration, or the space race from the 80s or 60s through the 80s, I suppose. They're pretty cool. Raketa actually makes multiple models as I test out the keyless works here and then get the calendar going back on. Again, this one's called the Perpetual calendar. At least that's what English speakers have nicknamed it. Again, it isn't actually a perpetual calendar, but it does have some type of thing where you can do some calculation based on what's on there. And I don't know, if you had a calculator, maybe you could figure it out. But it looks cool and stuff. But again, there's other models too, and they're all reasonably priced on eBay. Again, it's a little bit of it's a little sketchy of a market, and you don't have a lot of recourse if you get something that you didn't want. So you do have to be a little bit picky, but the prices are definitely good, especially after having kind of gone through the majority of the strip down and the rebuild on this watch. I'm like, hey, this is a fine watch. It's a totally okay movement in here. Again, and we're not talking about beautifully finished. In fact, it's quite ugly as far as finish goes. But functionality wise, look at this. There's the pull out function that I was talking about. So you actually pull the crown out and it kicks the day over, which is really neat. It's a cool take on a quick set date. And this is the day, so that goes in. And things are really kind of shaping up here. We are almost done with this build. And like I said, I've been impressed. I think that if you're looking to get into vintage watches and you don't mind something kind of quirky, this might be a good place to start one of these Raketa watches. And I think that they're pretty cool from like a conversation starter. It's kind of like, what's going on with that watch? It's got Russian on it. It's got Roman numerals. It has date, years on it somehow, this weird rotating thing. What I'm doing here, by the way, is I'm putting the pallet forks and the balance in one dip, which is a solvent that cleans off anything that was not cleaned off prior, after having gone through the watch cleaning machine, as these are really important parts of the watch. And with that, we can begin the final stretch here as we get the pallet forks put into place. Again, looking at the pallet fork bridge here, look, that thing's a cheap piece of stamped metal, but it works. And again, just making sure that the pallet fork is seated properly. And this is a big moment of truth. It was running before. I expect it to run now, but this is always an exciting point in the rebuild to see if it'll kick back up or if we have a lot more work to do. It's also just kind of a thrill. I mean, honestly, this is like if you work on cars when you finally get done with a big project and then you get to fire up the engine for the first time. Okay, get the balance down and let's see if it'll fire up. There we go. Beautiful. Also, it looks like it's running quite strong. After having worked on a bunch of watches, you kind of get a feel for when one's barely chugging along. That would mean a low amplitude, or when it's, got some real life in it. And this one really seems to have some life in it. It's cruising along nice. And I haven't even put a full wind in it yet. You really do have to wind the watch up all the way before you know how it's going to perform. So this is fantastic. The rebuild has gone well, and this thing seems to be running beautifully. I'm kind of thinking this is awesome at this point. Yeah, I think that the reason that these are so cheap is because of how mass produced they were. They were produced infinite of these things over in the former Soviet Union during the time when these factories were in full swing, because they were state owned or whatever. So that it was what you could get if you wanted a watch. There was a few other brands as well, but different system. Okay, so now we need to spend some time here getting this thing in good shape, though, to put on. As you can see, there's some staining or maybe some rust staining on the edges of this. I have to be careful because this does have a printed surface on it, and I don't want to take it off. So I'm just going to take a little bit of Rodico and just see if I can't get the majority of the worst staining off without damaging or picking up any of the print. Because if it's going to pick up the print, then I won't bother. But as you can see, it looks a little better already, just having gotten just a little bit of that staining off. Some of it was too stubborn, though. Now we can turn our attention to the watch case itself. And it's pretty gross, actually. I'm going to just use pegwood to get the big chunks off of it. But there's actually a lot of dirt piled up. You can see it starting to get on my workbench even. As this thing is in kind of dire need of a clean. Now, we won't be able to do any casework on it of any sort as it is plated. You can't polish that. It'll just go through. But look at that. Ugh. Ugh. So again, just going to go over all the edges with a piece of pegwood here. That's the bezel as well, just to try to get the big chunks off. And then I'm thinking we're going to need to throw this thing in the ultrasonic cleaner. This is the back of that bezel, and it's got a whole lot of dirt and kind of grime built up on it as well. So yeah, a lot of dirt needs to come off of this to make sure that it keeps looking and functioning well. And yeah, please, no more on my workbench. Thank you very much. But ultrasonic cleaners are really great for stuff like this. They can get into spaces that you can't. And here's our ultrasonic. Now, I'm just going to put those three main components of the case in there because I don't want to put the indicator dial ring thing because it could mess with the finish on it and it's just not worth it. Because if it takes that off, that really sucks. I don't want that to happen. So it comes out, a quick rinse in the sink. And then we can dry off the parts and then inspect them. Let's see how they look. Oh, much better. Much, much better. So now that's what I'm talking about. And I'm looking and is there a little bit of, no, that's just some pitting or staining. That's not going to come off. So yeah, this thing's good to go. And we can reassemble the rest of the case. Now, we do have a little bit more work to do, though, before we can actually put this thing fully together. And that, of course, is replacing this crystal. Not only is this crystal discolored, damaged, and cracked, it definitely needs to be replaced. So the way you do this is you have to measure the crystal, or you can measure the slot that it goes in, or you can measure both. So let's see what this one measures up to just as it sits. 36.15 millimeters looks like about where it wants to sit. And so when you go to order your crystal, you're going to want to get as close to that as possible. So I got a 362, which is actually 36 point. In fact, here, I'll just show you. There you go. 36.2 millimeters. And it looks like the right shape as well. It can always be a little weird to figure out, because they have like domed and over-domed and all these kind of weird words. But this one seemed to be the best for me. So what I like to do is just a quick test fit. This will not actually snap in because the crystal's bigger than the space it goes so that it can put pressure on the outside once it's seated. So as I was taught by Mark, I'm going to use my rober press. And this is I did not understand how these worked until he did a video on it. But now I get it. And basically what you do is you take the crystal. So first you take the case part that it's going to go to and put it below. Then you take the crystal and put it on the soft die on the bottom. And you pick one of the aluminum dies on the top that is just the right size for the crystal. And when you push it down, it actually just bends the crystal down around that soft die. And that has the effect of decreasing the diameter of the crystal. Now, if you did this too much, it would snap. It would break the crystal. But these are very tough crystals. Then you can bring the case part up to the crystal. And once it's seated, you just undo the pressure from the rober press. And then the crystal releases the tension into the bezel in this case. Pretty cool. And it makes it a real snap to do it, not hard at all. And this crystal looks fantastic. Exactly what we needed. So job done there. I'm happy with that. And now we can start actually putting this thing all the way back together. And that means recasing the movement and putting the bezel back on. And I'm thinking we might need a new watch strap for this thing too. It didn't come with one. So this is a little bit weird because of this, information ring. I don't really know what to call it, but it's a very, very simple thing. It has those teeth around the outside, and then there's a little crown on the outside of the case that attaches to a little toothed gear that runs it around. It's that little bronze crown at the bottom. That's it. So there, now the movement's back in. And we need to just use the movement screws to make sure that it's seated properly and held in place. And we are almost done with this thing. The back still looks really rough, but who cares? It's the back of the watch, right? I mean, I'm looking to get a bargain on like a cool, functional timepiece here. The fact that the back looks horrible, and it doesn't really bother me that much. And there we go. You can see that ring now turning around the outside. That means I can put the case on. The case back on, I should say. And now we can turn our attention to the dial, where we now can put the hands back on. And what I'm doing here is getting the date to just click over to the next day. And that means it's midnight. And then I can put the hands on at the 12 o'clock position, which is in this case midnight. And that way the calendar will turn over at exactly the right time every single night. If there's no calendar, it doesn't matter which hour you set the hands at. You can set it at 3 o'clock or whatever, as long as they're lined up right. But this one does have calendar function, and that means you got to have that calendar turn over at the right time. Otherwise, you're never going to know what day it is. On this one, it's written in Russian, so I'll never know what day it is anyway. But good practice, right? And then what you want to do is sort of look to the side, and I'm actually just going to kind of use the hand setting tool to just tweak the hand very, very slightly. But basically, you just want to make sure that the hands have a little bit of room so that they don't run into each other as they go around the dial. Because that'll stop the watch or knock one of the hands off, and you'll have to open it back up and fix it. So best just to get it right. Okay, the seconds hand goes on as well, and now I can do a quick test. And what you want to do here is just make sure that the hands can go around a good, the whole way and not hit into anything, that the minute hand's not hitting the second hand or the hour hand, that nothing's dragging on the dial, and also just that it's working, like that nothing's getting out of balance here where like the minute hand gets off of where it's supposed to be. And then I'm, of course, also checking that the calendar works, and it looks like it turned over at midnight or shortly thereafter, which is pretty normal. And there, once again, I'm showing you how that works. And there we go. Now we can put the bezel back on the top. Again, these watches have a removable bezel, but it's really easy to put them back on. Just use some compressed air here to make sure that there's no dust or little fibers or anything on the dial or on the inside of the crystal. And then these are just friction fit. Friction fit just means pressed on. That's all that means if you hear that. So with this bezel, there we go. And it just clicks into place. And that looks fantastic, I have to say, especially with that new crystal. Beautiful. Now, I mentioned that it's time for a new strap on this because it didn't come with one. And I got this little thing from Esslinger. That's a website, American website for watchmaking that I use quite a bit. And they have this little thing that was $1 or something, and it just lets you measure the lug width really quick and easy. You can use any tool that you want to do it, but that's just the easiest way. And then I got this watch band from Barton, which is, if you're looking, I mentioned Boulong & Sons as one that I really like. This one is like American brand that's really cheap. I mean, these things are $20 or $25 total, and they're pretty good. And they have the little things that let you put it back on, let you put it on easily. You don't need to use any tools to do it, even though I happen to have them. Okay, last thing now, let's check and see how it performs. Ooh, wow, this is so much better than it was before. Look at that, just a few seconds a day, 0.1 millisecond beat error is totally acceptable, and a nice healthy amplitude of 293. These are the type of numbers that you want to see. And yeah, this thing just needed a really great service. And wow, I gotta say, this actually exceeded my expectations. I had pretty darn low expectations for this watch, if I'm being honest, because it was so cheap. And yeah, it's quirky and cool and kind of neat, but I mean, we're not talking about a really nice, Swiss timepiece here or even, anything else. It's just kind of a junker. But that being said, It's good enough. The build quality on this, after having gone through it, was totally acceptable. There was not one part that I was thinking, okay, guys, come on, you really went too cheap on this. It was all fine. Again, not pretty, but fine and functional. And look what you get. A cool watch. I mean, this is a cool watch for $50, especially after having serviced it, and now it runs really well and it looks great too. And when you show it to people, they are going to go, what is going on with this watch? It's really funny because you can wear a really nice watch and nobody cares. Like, that's the thing that, people that are into watches discover at some point, which is that nobody cares what watch you're wearing. It's for you. It's a thing that you get to look at and you get to enjoy for yourself. But with something like this that has weird writing on it and all that stuff, people actually do go, what is going on with that thing? And now, this is a Raketa Perpetual calendar, less than $50 on eBay, mass produced to the hilt by the former Soviet Union. And you can get them now. They'll send them over from Ukraine or from Russia proper, and you can have these. And I got to say, if you're trying to get into watchmaking, these might be a really good place to start, where you could kind of mess up a little bit and not get punished too bad. That is going to do it for this one. I want to thank you for joining me. If you like the video, you can do the whole subscribe thing. You know what to do. If you like stuff on YouTube, you know what to do. I don't need to tell you. You can find me on Instagram for project updates in between videos going up at wristwatch_revival. And we'll see you next time.